This story was sent by a viewer who wishes to remain anonymous. The ending of this story was considered the most terrifying part by many viewers. No more talking. Let's start the story. Ryan Calloway was not the type of man who scared easily. He'd spent 12 years in the Army, survived 2 tours overseas, and after returning home, he literally threw himself into mastering every major trail in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He knew the terrain the way most of us know our own neighborhoods. He was methodical, completely prepared, and entirely comfortable alone in the backcountry in a way that most people just simply aren't. When he finally shared his account, he prefaced it with a simple plea. He said, "I need you to understand what kind of person I am before I tell you what happened, because if I heard this from someone else, I wouldn't believe it either." Chapter 1. Familiar Ground. Memorial Day weekend 2021. Ryan planned a 2-night solo backpacking trip on a familiar section of the Appalachian Trail, entering at Newfound Gap and hiking south toward Double Spring Gap Shelter. He'd actually completed this exact route twice before. He set out on a quiet, cool Friday morning right at 6:15 a.m. The weather was absolutely ideal, and by the time he reached the higher elevation ridgeline, he was completely alone. He arrived at the shelter by early afternoon, claimed a spot, enjoyed an exceptional hike out to Siler's Bald, and returned by 6 p.m. He cooked his dinner, spoke briefly with 2 northbound hikers, and was zipped up in his sleeping bag before dark. He slept perfectly well that night, without a single unusual issue. Chapter 2. Paced by the Unseen. Saturday, May 29th. Early that morning, the isolation began to shift. Ryan set out early for a longer day hike, moving comfortably through the thick, white mountain fog that was just sitting in the hollows between the ridges. But as he pushed deeper into the misty morning, the reality of his surroundings began to change. About 2 miles out from the shelter, he heard something moving in the thick undergrowth, running parallel to the trail. Ryan stopped. He stood dead still and listened, trying to get a read on the size of whatever was moving out there. But whatever it wasn't the blind wandering of a bear or a deer. The movement was keeping pace with him. He took a few steps forward. The movement in the undergrowth moved forward too. He stopped. It stopped. He took 3 quick steps. The sound in the woods took 3 quick steps. It was matching his pace, step for step, intentionally tracking alongside him, maybe 15 to 20 feet off the trail. He loudly clapped his hands and called out. The movement stopped. For 5 full minutes, there was absolute silence. He heard absolutely nothing. But when he started walking again, faster this time, the sound resumed in the woods beside him, precisely matching his new pace. Chapter 3. 3 rhythmic knocks. Facing the undergrowth, he stopped once more. This time, he turned directly to face the sound in the woods. He stared into the dense trees and called out, "Hey, who's there?" From the profound silence came a low, deliberate, rhythmic knocking, wood on wood. 3 heavy strikes of a branch against the tree trunk. A long pause. Then 2 more. The sound lasted about 10 seconds before stopping entirely. Standing perfectly still, Ryan felt a slow, cold fear wash over him. It wasn't the sudden adrenaline of an immediate threat, but the chilling dread of something he could neither see nor categorize. He turned around and walked fast, his trekking poles firmly gripped and ready, making a purposeful, quiet retreat all the way back to the shelter. He spent the midday hours at the shelter, trying his best to rationalize the experience. He blamed the footsteps on an off-trail hiker who simply didn't want to respond. He blamed the deliberate knocking on a woodpecker or fallen branches echoing strangely through the heavy fog. Chapter 4. The Shape on the Trail. 4 p.m. Feeling steadier by late afternoon, he decided to attempt a short evening walk. He headed just a mile or so up a narrow section of the trail, where the tree cover thickens heavily on both sides and completely blocks out the sky. He was about half a mile out when he saw it. Standing directly in the center of the trail, approximately 40 yards ahead of him, in the flat, diffuse afternoon light, was the dark silhouette of a person. It was tall and unnaturally still. It had no discernible face, no colors, no specific details at all. Hikers shift their weight, they adjust their packs, or they look around, but this figure stood with an architectural stillness, like something that had grown there straight from the earth. Ryan stopped. He called out, "Hello? You okay up there?"
His own voice sounded far too small, just swallowed up by the silence under the trees. The figure did not move.
Then, without moving toward or away from him, the tall figure slowly rotated until it stood in perfect profile. It stepped off the right edge of the trail and disappeared into the trees. There was absolutely no sound of snapping branches, no rustling brush, no heavy footfalls. It simply vanished into the undergrowth, as though the woods had just opened up to accept it.
Chapter 5. Escape in the Dark. The Retreat. Ryan immediately turned around to begin the retreat. He hiked back to the shelter, packed his entire camp in under 20 minutes, and began walking out. He hiked all the way back to the nearly empty parking lot at Newfound Gap in the pitch dark, relying only on the narrow beam of his headlamp. On Tuesday, May 31st, he filed an official report. A park ranger followed up 3 days later, confirming there were 0 other incident reports filed for that weekend in that area. Left without answers, Ryan posted his account on a hiking forum on June 19, 2021, where it was shared over 4,000 times. In the wake of his post, dozens of commenters came forward reporting similar experiences in that exact stretch of the trail. Among these replies were at least 6 separate accounts detailing the exact same unexplainable rhythmic knocking sound echoing from the trees. Chapter 6. Left Behind. The Aftermath. The National Park Service has never officially commented on these reports. As for Ryan Calloway, he still hikes the backcountry alone, but he has never returned to that specific section of the Appalachian Trail. It wasn't an immediate physical threat to his life that kept him away, but rather a profound, chilling awareness. As he put it, what I felt on that trail wasn't danger, exactly. It was more like the feeling that something out there knew I was there and wanted me to know that it knew. He realized that whatever had stood in his path had simply allowed him to walk away, and that whatever it was perfectly comfortable letting me leave. Like it wasn't done, like it was just done with me for now. If you found this story compelling, please remember to like and subscribe.
Moving on to the next one, this story was sent by a viewer who wishes to remain anonymous. He requested us not to reveal his name because he is still afraid. He claims that after that night, he has never been able to sleep normally again. No more talking, let's start the story. Melissa Tran had been planning the Savannah trip with Jocelyn and Dana for almost 4 months. All 3 of them were in their early 30s, completely buried under the weight of their demanding careers. They had reached that fragile point in adult life where a weekend away feels less like a luxury and more like a strict medical necessity. Savannah was originally Jocelyn's idea. She had visited once before for a bachelorette trip and fell completely under the spell of the city. She spoke endlessly about the Spanish moss hanging like heavy gray curtains off the ancient live oak trees, the uneven cobblestone streets that tested your balance, the brooding old colonial architecture, and the ghost tours. That last part was what finally sold Melissa and Dana. They were the kind of close-knit friends who deeply enjoyed being scared together, but only in that safe, strictly controlled way that haunted houses and scary movies are scary. They wanted the thrill of the fear, the adrenaline rush, but they wanted it to be fun. They never intended to experience something truly, deeply terrifying. They booked a room at a small, highly rated boutique inn located deep within the historic district, right on a quiet, shaded block just off Monterey Square. It was called the Aldrich House. They arrived on a Friday evening, the 4th of March, just around 7 o'clock. The drive down from Atlanta took agonizingly longer than expected due to heavy construction on Interstate 16, and by the time they finally pulled up to the curb, the sun had already set. They were exhausted, hungry, and desperate for a glass of wine. But as they stepped out of the car, they had to pause and admire the building. The inn was undeniably beautiful. It was a towering 3-story antebellum structure boasting massive white columns. Flickering gas-style lanterns flanked the heavy wooden front door, casting long, dancing shadows across the brickwork, and the window boxes were overflowing with dark winter pansies. Stepping through the heavy front doors felt like stepping through a portal into the deep past. The lobby was enveloped in heavy, dark wood paneling that seemed to swallow the ambient light. The floor was covered in thick, intricate Persian rugs that completely muffled their footsteps, creating a heavy, insulated silence. Standing in the corner, tall and imposing, was an antique grandfather clock. Its slow, heavy ticking echoed through the quiet lobby. It didn't just mark the time, it seemed to dictate it, ticking with the undeniable, heavy authority of another century entirely. The owner of the inn, a tall, older woman named Patricia Voss, checked them in personally.
She was perfectly pleasant, offering them that specific brand of gracious Southern hospitality that makes you feel both warmly welcomed and yet somehow slightly watched. After handing over the heavy brass key, she guided them up the winding wooden staircase to the 3rd floor, leading them all the way down the dimly lit hallway to a large corner room. Room 7. As they stepped inside, the original wide plank flooring groaned softly under their weight. The room was spacious, featuring 2 queen beds, a small cot, and a large bay window that looked directly down over the dark, quiet expanse of the square. The air inside the room was thick and still. It carried a very specific, ancient scent, a mingling of dry cedar wood, old decaying paper, and a faint, powdery floral note that none of the 3 women could quite identify.
Before leaving them to unpack, Patricia paused in the doorway. She rested her hand lightly on the wooden doorframe and looked around the space with a soft, knowing expression. "This is the oldest room in the house," she told them quietly. "It was the original owner's private study. We think it has the best energy in the building." She offered them a warm, polite smile before stepping out and pulling the heavy door shut behind her with a solid click. At the time, they smiled back. It sounded like nothing more than charming, atmospheric innkeeper small talk, designed to give the tourists exactly the kind of historical flavor they were paying for. Their first evening in Savannah unfolded exactly as they had hoped. They quickly dropped their bags on the floor, freshened up, and walked out into the cool night air. They found a cozy wine bar just 2 blocks away, indulging in large glasses of red wine before walking over to a busy restaurant on Congress Street for plates of rich shrimp and grits. By 9 o'clock, they were standing outside in a group, ready for their walking ghost tour. Their guide, a highly theatrical young man named Theodore wearing a sweeping long coat, led them through the cobblestone streets. He regaled them with gruesome, dramatic stories of Savannah's dark history, the yellow fever outbreaks, the Civil War casualties, and the restless spirits said to wander the old squares. The tour wrapped up around 11. The 3 friends walked back to the Aldrich house feeling perfectly content, slightly wine-warm, and laughing loudly in the quiet street. They were even joking about which one of them would be the first to scream if they actually saw a ghost. The answer to that joke came much sooner and much more quietly than any of them could have possibly anticipated. They had been asleep for perhaps 2 hours. The room was pitch black. The historic district outside was dead silent. It was roughly 1:30 in the morning. Jocelyn suddenly, without a single sound, sat bolt upright in her bed. She reached across the mattress in the dark, her hand finding Melissa's arm. Her grip was tight, frantic. "Someone's in here," Jocelyn breathed, her voice a barely audible, trembling whisper. Melissa, who had always been a remarkably light sleeper, came fully awake in a fraction of a second. The adrenaline hit her bloodstream like ice water. She didn't move a muscle. Beside her, Dana was awake now too. All 3 women lay completely frozen in the pitch-black room, barely daring to breathe, their eyes wide and straining against the darkness. They listened into the heavy, dead silence of the room, and within seconds, Melissa realized exactly what had woken Jocelyn. There was a sound. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a dramatic crash or a sudden bang. It was something far worse, because it was so completely ordinary. It was gentle. It was the distinct, rhythmic creak of the old wooden floorboards groaning under the weight of someone walking. The sound originated from the far side of the room, over by the bay window. Then, the sound shifted. It was moving. Someone or something was slowly walking right between their 2 queen beds, making its way gradually toward the heavy wooden door leading out to the hallway. They lay there, paralyzed by a primal, suffocating terror, forced to listen to the cadence of the footsteps. And it was the pacing that made it so deeply horrifying. The footfalls were not hurried. They were not frantic or stealthy or aggressive. They were terribly, agonizingly deliberate. Unhurried. Step. A long, heavy pause. Step. It sounded exactly like someone taking a casual midnight stroll across the room, someone who knew they had absolutely every right to be there and felt no need whatsoever to hide their presence. The footsteps slowly reached the door, and then they stopped. The silence rushed back in, ringing in their ears. Melissa couldn't take it anymore. Her hands shot out in the dark, fumbling blindly over the nightstand until her fingers found the switch. The lamp clicked on, flooding the room with sudden, blinding yellow light. The 3 women gasped, bracing themselves to see who was standing at the door. But there was no one. The room was completely empty. Scrambling out of bed, their hearts pounding against their ribs, they frantically searched every inch of the space. They threw open the bathroom door. They checked the small, cramped closet. Nothing. The heavy wooden door to the hallway was still firmly shut, the brass deadbolt thrown, the metal security chains still securely engaged from the inside. They checked the bay window. It was tightly closed and latched. There was no one in the room, and absolutely no way anyone could have left. There was no chance of sleep after that. They pulled the blankets around their shoulders and huddled together on one of the queen beds, leaving every single light in the room blazing. For hours, they spoke in hushed, nervous tones, desperately trying to construct a rational explanation. They told each other what everyone says in these situations. It was just an old house. The temperature drops at night, causing the ancient floorboards to contract and settle. It was just the wood groaning. They repeated this over and over, trying to bend their minds to accept it. But deep down, they knew it was a lie. Settling wood makes irregular, chaotic sounds, random pops and groans that follow no logical sequence. What they had listened to in the dark followed a perfect, terrifying pattern, a distinct bipedal rhythm, an even, methodical pace that traversed the entire length of the room. When the sun finally rose, casting bright, safe light through the bay window, the oppressive terror of the night began to recede. They spent their Saturdays stubbornly trying to have a normal, enjoyable vacation. They walked down to Broughton Street for hot coffee and powdered beignets, they browsed the boutiques, and they took a long, leisurely walk along the bustling riverfront. Surrounded by crowds and daylight, they managed to laugh about the previous night. They used that easy, slightly embarrassed tone people adopt when trying to dismiss something inexplicable. They agreed they were just tired from the drive, that the ghost tour had planted highly suggestive seeds in their exhausted minds, and that the creaking floors had simply played a trick on their nerves. By the time they finished a long, delicious dinner at a renovated warehouse restaurant on the river, they had almost entirely convinced themselves that they were perfectly safe. It was late when they finally returned to the Aldrich house on Saturday night. The lobby was quiet, the grandfather clock ticking away. They climbed the stairs to the third floor and entered room 7. Melissa was the last one through the door. She turned around to push the heavy door shut and engage the deadbolt. But as she turned the brass lock, her eyes swept across the room and landed on the small, antique wooden writing desk sitting quietly in the corner. It was a piece of furniture they hadn't used. It had been completely bare when they left that morning, but now, as Melissa looked at it, her stomach dropped so violently she felt physically sick. Melissa froze, her hands still resting on the deadbolt. Jocelyn and Dana, noticing her sudden rigid posture, turned to follow her gaze. For several long, agonizing seconds, nobody in the room took a breath. Nobody made a sound. They just stared at the object resting in the center of the wooden desk. The silence in the room was suffocating. Then Dana finally broke the quiet, her voice trembling with a quiet, horrified, absolute certainty. That wasn't there this morning. Melissa forced her legs to move. She slowly walked across the creaking floorboards toward the desk, her heart hammering in her throat. Resting plainly on the wood was a photograph. It wasn't in a frame, it was just a loose, thick piece of photo paper. It was black and white, the edges slightly curled and yellowed with severe age. It looked as though it had simply always been sitting there, waiting for them. Melissa reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. As she held it under the light of the lamp, she felt a cold rush of pure dread wash over her. She recognized the room in the picture instantly. The angles of the walls, the distinctive molding, the heavy bay window. It was a photograph of the exact room they were standing in, room 7. But the furniture was different, much older, and the image possessed a grainy, archaic quality that suggested it had been taken decades, perhaps a century prior. But it wasn't just a picture of an empty room. There was a figure standing in the center of the frame. It was a man dressed in dark, heavy clothing. He was standing right beside the very same antique writing desk where Melissa had just found the picture. His back was turned completely to the camera. He appeared perfectly still, standing rigidly, his face hidden as he stared blankly toward the blank wall. As Melissa, Jocelyn, and Dana huddled together, their eyes locked onto the photograph, they noticed the detail that made the blood freeze in their veins. While the man's face was hidden, his arm was slightly extended. His hand was resting squarely on the edge of the wooden desk, and his fingers, long and distinct in the stark black and white contrast, were extended. He was pointing directly toward the bay window across the room, the exact same window where the slow, heavy footsteps had originated the night before. And then, the true, impossible horror of the situation fully dawned on them. It wasn't just that a terrifying ancient photograph had appeared in their locked room, it was how it had appeared. That morning, before they left, Dana had casually tossed her white phone charger onto the desk. She had set a half-empty plastic water bottle right beside it. Those items were still sitting there. They hadn't been pushed aside, they hadn't been bumped or moved a single fraction of an inch.
The photograph had been placed meticulously, perfectly flat upon the wood, directly in the center of Dana's belongings, without disturbing a single thing.
The panic that took hold of them was total and immediate. They didn't pack, they didn't gather their coats. The three women practically ran out of room 7, flying down the 2 flights of winding wooden stairs to the ground floor. The lobby was dark, the grandfather clock ticking its slow, uncaring rhythm. They rushed to the heavy door of Patricia Voss's private office behind the reception desk and began knocking rapidly, desperately. A few moments later, the door opened. Patricia stood there, wrapped in a thick robe, her eyes heavy with sleep. Melissa didn't even speak. She just raised a shaking hand and held the yellowed photograph out in the dim light of the hallway. They waited for Patricia to gasp, to look confused, to ask where they had found such a thing.
But Patricia Voss did not gasp. Her expression didn't register shock or confusion or alarm. Instead, as she looked at the image trembling in Melissa's hand, her face settled into an expression that was infinitely worse. It was a look of deep, profound exhaustion. It was the look of someone confronting a burden they had carried for a very long time. She didn't reach out to take the photo. She simply looked at the 3 terrified women and spoke in a flat, heavy, matter-of-fact tone. "The photograph has been in the house for years," she said quietly. "It sometimes moves." She didn't try to explain it away. She didn't offer excuses. She just looked at them with tired eyes and immediately offered them a full, unquestioned refund.
They accepted the refund without a second of hesitation. They returned to room 7 just long enough to throw their belongings blindly into their bags, zipping them shut with trembling hands, never once taking their eyes off the corners of the room. Within 15 minutes, they were out the front door, the heavy wood slamming shut behind them. They fled Savannah under the cover of utter darkness. The drive back up Interstate 16 was a blur of black trees and silent tension, none of them speaking a word as the miles rolled by. They finally pulled into Atlanta at 3 o'clock in the morning, locking their doors behind them, leaving the Spanish moss and the cobblestone streets far behind. 6 months passed. The 3 women tried to bury the memory of that weekend, refusing to speak of it even among themselves. But eventually, a travel writer, researching a piece on unusual and haunted inn experiences across the American South, caught wind of the story and reached out to the Aldrich house. When contacted, Patricia Voss was incredibly tight-lipped. She refused to give an interview. Over a brief phone call, she would only confirm, very reluctantly, that Room 7 did indeed possess a long and documented history of unexplained incidents. When pressed about the photograph Melissa had found, Patricia admitted she knew the image well, but she flatly refused to discuss its origins or the man pictured within it. But she did offer one final, chilling detail to the writer before hanging up the phone. On that Sunday morning, just hours after Melissa, Jocelyn, and Dana had fled into the night, the cleaning staff cautiously unlocked the door to room 7 to prepare it for the next guest. They found the beds unmade. They found the room quiet and still. And they found the antique wooden writing desk in the corner, completely bare. The photograph had vanished as silently and impossibly as it had arrived. It has not been seen since. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel for more. Moving on to the next one, this story was sent by a viewer. The incident is so strange that it's hard to tell whether it was real or just a nightmare. No more talking, let's start the story.
Everyone who knew Daniel Hargrove would tell you the exact same thing. He was just the kind of guy who needed to get away. Not in a dramatic way. He was just a quiet, outdoorsy man who recharged by disappearing into the woods every fall. His wife, Karen, she'd stopped worrying years ago. He always came back Sunday evenings smelling of campfire smoke with a cooler full of fish and a peaceful grin. October 2019 was supposed to be no different.
Daniel rented a small cabin through an independent listing site. It wasn't one of those modern, sleek apps. It was an older, regional directory that still had that early 2000s web design, the kind where the photos looked like they were taken on a flip phone. The listing was for a property called Pine Ridge Rest. It was isolated, about 4 miles off Route 12, nestled right near the eastern shore of Mirror Lake in the dense, remote woods of northern Minnesota. The owner of the property, a man named Gerald Foss, communicated with Daniel only through email. His messages were brief, polite, and strictly functional. He gave Daniel the gate code, the location of the hidden key, and one single, highly specific piece of advice. He wrote, "Don't bother the boats on the North Dock, they're not mine, and the people who own them don't like strangers." Daniel read that email and thought absolutely nothing of it. Probably just local fishermen with territorial habits. He dealt with that kind of thing before. He arrived at the property on Friday afternoon, right around 3 p.m. The drive up was breathtaking. The tree line was just burning with autumn colors, and the cabin turned out to be much better than those grainy photos suggested. Small, impeccably clean, with a heavy stone fireplace and a wide wooden porch overlooking the completely still water, Mirror Lake. He unpacked, built a warm fire, ate a quiet dinner, and fell asleep by 9 to the soft sound of wind in the trees, exactly what he needed. But the first strange thing happened early the following morning. Saturday would mark the beginning of a subtle, undeniable shift in the atmosphere around the cabin, a slow sequence of events that started the moment he woke up. Daniel woke up around 6 a.m., planning to go fishing. He grabbed his gear, walked down the narrow dirt path to the water, and stepped out onto the south dock. He was careful about that, making sure he was on the south dock, just like Gerald instructed. As he set his tackle box down, he glanced up the shoreline. Maybe 200 feet away was the north dock, and tied to it was a boat that absolutely had not been there the night before. It was a flat-bottomed aluminum fishing boat, completely unpainted. There was no motor on the back, just a pair of oars lying perfectly still. Daniel looked at it, remembered the warning about the locals, and just dismissed it. He set up his rod, cast his line into the mirror-like water, and spent 3 incredibly peaceful hours catching nothing, but enjoying every solitary second of the morning. When his morning fishing was over, he packed up his gear and walked the footpath back up to the cabin. It was 9 a.m. As he approached the porch, he stopped cold. The heavy wooden front door of the cabin was wide open. It wasn't broken open, the wood wasn't splintered, the lock wasn't forced. It was just open. He was absolutely certain he had closed it behind him when he left at dawn. He stood frozen at the edge of the porch for a long moment, just listening. He heard nothing but the gentle birdsong in the trees and the faint rhythmic lap of the lake water against the shore behind him. Cautiously, he stepped inside. He checked the living room, the kitchen, the bedroom, the bathroom. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was missing. He noticed the heavy wooden door had a slightly warped frame. Standing there in the morning daylight, he convinced himself it just hadn't latched properly when he pulled it shut. He made breakfast. He forced himself to forget about it.
That night, Saturday, October 12th, is when things stopped having easy, rational explanations. He'd spent the entire afternoon hiking a rugged 4-mile trail looping around the south end of the lake. By the time he finally made his way back to Pine Ridge Rest, it was nearly completely dark. He took a hot shower, ate dinner, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and carried it out to the wooden porch to sit in the cold light air and watch the stars come out over the black water. He sat there in total silence for a long time. Then, right around 10:30 p.m., he noticed a light glowing down on the north dock.
At first, he assumed it was just a lantern. It had that distinct, warm, flickering quality of a flame burning inside glass. Someone was standing out there on the north dock, holding a lantern. Daniel narrowed his eyes, squinting into the pitch black. There was definitely a figure standing there, a silhouette cutting through the dark. They were standing completely still at the very end of the wooden dock, holding the warm light low, right down by their side. Driven by basic neighborly instinct, Daniel raised his hand and gave a friendly wave. The figure didn't wave back. It didn't shift. It just stood there. For 5 minutes, then 10 minutes, not moving a single muscle. The light down by their side didn't swing or bob the way a lantern naturally does when a person shifts their weight, or turns, or even reads. It was unnervingly motionless. Sitting alone on the porch, Daniel began to feel a slow, creeping discomfort spreading through his chest, a deep unease he couldn't quite name. There was something terribly wrong about the sheer stillness of the silhouette. And then his eyes drifted down from the figure to the water below it. He realized what was causing that cold dread in his stomach. The warm, flickering light at the end of the dock was casting absolutely no reflection on the dark, glass-like surface of the lake. Daniel stood up. He walked back inside the cabin, shut the heavy front door, and locked the deadbolt. He told himself it was a trick of the vast distance. He told himself it was just a weird angle of the light, or maybe the whiskey playing with his tired mind. He told himself these rational excuses firmly, repeatedly, as he lay rigid in his bed. Staring up into the dark room, listening to the suffocating silence outside the cabin walls, he'd almost managed to convince his racing heart to slow down. He'd almost convinced himself to go to sleep. And then he heard the sound. Footsteps. Heavy, distinct footsteps walking on the wooden planks of the porch outside. They were slow, completely unhurried. Daniel knew instantly that this was not the sound of an animal wandering out of the woods. The footfalls were far too deliberate, far too evenly spaced. It was the unmistakable, rhythmic sound of a heavy person walking. The footsteps slowly crossed the full length of the front porch, the old wood creaking under the weight of each calculated stride.
And then the footsteps stopped. They halted directly outside Daniel's bedroom window. Daniel didn't move a muscle. He lay completely rigid beneath the heavy blankets, feeling his heart slamming violently against his ribs. He was paralyzed, staring straight up at the ceiling. When he first arrived, he noticed the cabin had no curtains on the bedroom window. He thought nothing of it at the time, given how utterly remote and isolated the place was. But now, lying in the dark with someone standing just inches away on the other side of the glass, the pitch-black void of that uncurtained window felt enormous. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. He did not look at the window. Even later, when recounting the story, he couldn't fully explain why. But in that moment, something ancient, deep, and purely animalistic inside his brain flooded him with one absolute certainty. He must not turn his head. He must not look at the window. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the wooden planks of the ceiling. He lay trapped in that frozen state for what felt like an hour. The footsteps outside never resumed. The person never walked away. After a long, agonizing amount of time passed in complete silence, Daniel heard one final sound. It was a sound he'd spend the entire next week trying desperately to rationalize. Coming from the absolute dark, from just inches outside the thin pane of window glass, came a low, almost musical hum. It wasn't a tune he recognized. It was just 3 or 4 notes vibrating in the cold air, softly repeated. And then, absolute silence fell over the cabin. Daniel didn't sleep a single second for the rest of that night. As Sunday morning approached, he packed all his belongings into his truck before the sun had even fully risen over the tree line. His hands were shaking, but his mind was made up. He wasn't going to cause a scene. He wasn't going to search the woods. He was simply going to leave early, and he was going to do it without incident. But before he got into the driver's seat to leave Piner Rest forever, a morbid curiosity pulled at him. He walked slowly down the dirt path to the edge of the South Dock one last time. The morning air was cold and gray. He looked up the shoreline, tracing the distance to the North Dock. The aluminum boat was completely gone. The water had receded slightly overnight, leaving a stretch of deep, thick mud exposed at the base of the North Dock. And there, clearly and deeply pressed into the thick shoreline mud, he saw them. Footprints. The heavy tracks began at the very edge of the water. They walked slowly and methodically out of the lake, dragging through the wet earth, leading straight up onto the wooden planks of the North Dock. And then, they stopped. The tracks didn't return. There were no footprints leading back into the water, and there were no footprints leading into the woods. They just stopped. It looked as though whoever or whatever had made those deep impressions had walked up out of the black water, stepped onto the wood, and simply ceased to exist. Daniel got into his truck and drove the entire distance back to St. Paul without stopping once. He called his wife Karen from the road, keeping his voice steady, telling her he decided to cut the trip short because the weather had turned sour. He didn't tell her what actually happened for 3 agonizing weeks. When he finally broke his silence, sitting across from her at their kitchen table, he kept his voice very level and completely factual. He looked at her and told her that he did not believe in paranormal things. He told her he still didn't, but he also told her he knew exactly what he had heard humming outside his window. He knew exactly what he had seen standing on the dark dock, and he knew with absolute certainty that he had not imagined the heavy footprints coming out of the lake. The following Monday, Daniel drafted an email to Gerald Foss asking about the North Dock and if any other renters had reported anything unusual. Gerald never replied. 2 months later, the listing for Pine Ridge Rest vanished entirely from the directory, just like the tracks in the mud. Daniel Hargrove has not rented a cabin in the woods since, leaving us with one chilling question: what exactly stepped out of Mirror Lake that night? And more importantly, where did it go? If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe for more. You can also send us your true horror stories. If you've experienced something terrifying yourself, or if something scary happened to your family members, relatives, or friends, share it with us. Real paranormal experiences, creepy incidents, unexplained events, or any disturbing true story are welcome. Send your true horror stories in this email.